We'll go ahead and get started. It is nice to see you in person rather than on Zoom like last Monday. Looking forward to seeing you every Monday as we explore revolutions. Remember, Thursday is your first option if you want to do your optional Beyond the Classroom experience right off the bat. Thursday at 1 o'clock or at 6 o'clock, we will have the Ken Burns, Sarah Botstein, David Schwartz documentary, a digest of it, about 35 minutes rather than 13 hours, right? So quite the deal. And following that will be a panel of historians, including Dr. Nelson, Dr. Carol Busey, who's historian of Davidson County, Dr. Torrin Gatson from the history department here, and Dr. Monica Butler, who's an alumni of MTSU, followed by Q&A. So that's your first optional Beyond the Classroom opportunity on Thursday. If you want to get those sort of moving forward quickly, that will be your first option. Today, we're very happy to welcome Dr. Lynn Nelson to give our first honors lecture connected to our Revolution series. Dr. Nelson is one of my junior colleagues in the history department. You may also be familiar with him because he frequently teaches the first half of the American History Survey here in the Honors College. He's the author of an environmental history of an early Virginia plantation, and most recently, coming out very shortly, the Journal of East Tennessee History. He's written an article about the semi-quincentennial and specifically the ideas and histories of Tennesseans connected to the American Revolution. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lynn Nelson.
All right. The title of my talk, What the American Revolution Meant to Tennesseans at the Time. So obviously, we need to start by talking about French Canada. Okay, this will make sense. Right? In the summer of 1775, okay, this is a few months after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Continental Congress, and I'm not going to call it the U.S. Congress because we're still about a year away from the Declaration of Independence, an important point to remember. The Continental Congress authorized an American military expedition to march into Canada, specifically what was at this point the British province of Quebec, right? Invade and conquer it. Right? Now, what Congress thought they were doing was recognizing the fact that Quebec, right, had been up until 1763, little more than a decade before, a French province, a French colony. Right? In the course of the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, the French had been defeated and forced to cede their holdings in North America, including French Canada, to the British. Right? And so Quebec had become a British colony. However, the bulk of the population, right, in this province, as it was concentrated along the St. Lawrence River between Montreal and Quebec City, remained French, 30+ thousand people, right? Very reluctantly British subjects. And down in Congress, the idea was that if what the 13 colonies were doing was a resistance movement against the tyranny of the British Crown, well, these people in French Canada, the Quebecois, would be very receptive to the idea, right? And that if American troops marched into French Canada, they would find a welcome reception, military and economic support. They would cover or be able to cover one of their flanks, right? Particularly northern New England, and also maybe neutralize or win over the support of some of the Great Lakes Indian tribes. Okay? They sent out 2 expeditions, one under James Montgomery and one under Benedict Arnold, while he was still on our side, that went up into Canada. Right? Montgomery marched up past Lake Champlain, appeared outside of Montreal. The small number of British troops who were there quickly ran, right? And the population, the French population of the city, largely greeted the American invasion. Oh, you're here to resist the British crown. Right? That sounds good. Right? Montgomery then advanced from Montreal down the St. Lawrence, where he met Arnold's expedition outside the walls of Quebec City, and they proceeded then to attack with a failed attack, and then attempted to besiege the city of Quebec. Now, the deeper point, the deeper problem though, was that after some initial enthusiasm over this American invasion, right, the population of French Canada gradually withdrew their support. Okay? There are a number of reasons for this. One, immediately they saw, like a lot of people throughout the British Empire, that this whole America thing was a very shaky, uncertain project, and they would be throwing their lot in with something that, had no certain prospects of survival. The concrete way, in fact, that this appeared to the Quebecois is that American troops tried to pay for military supplies, blankets, boots, food, and so on, with paper money. Okay? Not a good thing to be taking hold of, particularly from a government that didn't really exist and had no certainty of existing 3 or 4 years later. But there were also some deeper issues for the Quebecers as well, as they thought about this whole idea of America as it was being presented to them. Okay. The Declaration of Independence had not yet been passed, but certainly the idea of an independent America was being bandied about. And from the perspective of French Canadians, they immediately thought here, well, wait a minute, hold on. We're French. These 13 colonies are heavily, overwhelmingly British, okay, in their population, in their tradition. We're French Catholic. Right? These colonies are overwhelmingly Protestant. And one of their great fears, in fact, at being conquered by the British was not so much British tyranny back in 1763, but rather the fear that if they were incorporated into the British Empire, this huge population of New Englanders, okay, we're going to head up north, okay, settle now in this new British province and quickly overwhelm, right, the older French population, overwhelm them economically, overwhelm them socially, culturally, and especially overwhelm them politically. Right? And so, as I said, the Quebecois pulled back their support. Right? And American troops then, okay, trying to besiege Quebec City, bereft of the hoped-for militia support from French Canadians, bereft of the food and other supplies that they had hoped to get, and also decimated during the winter of 75-76 by smallpox, typhus, and other diseases of the military camp, were driven back from the city by British reinforcements sent from Europe, and the whole expedition retreated to Montreal and then back down into New York. Right? And the Quebecers then lost their chance to be Americans. Okay? Now you may ask them, maybe they should rethink this, because the end result was that they got stuck in a country with a bunch of Canadians. Actually, I'll get to you after I'm done. Keep in mind what you're asking. And it's solid Tim Hortons wherever they go. And, well, I know my own family likes to get together sometimes in the summer and rent a house on one of the main beaches. And, well, that's what Quebecers do during the summer. They all get in their SUVs and they drive down to the main beaches. And as Dr. Sayward, who is a native of upstate New York, also informs me, they all leave Montreal, drive over the U.S. line to do their shopping in New York. Right? So they may be rethinking that. They may be open-minded about this. It would be a first step on the road to Greenland, obviously, incorporating Quebec. Right? Now, this is the point where I do come back and answer, why am I talking about French Canada in a lecture about the American Revolution in Tennessee? Because what went on in Quebec in 1775-76 illustrates a much bigger, broader problem, question, okay, or that was created across the North American continent on into the Caribbean by the American Revolution. Okay? And one that did have particular application in that small area of British settlement in upper East Tennessee on the other side of the mountains. Okay? And that question, that problem was, there we go. What exactly was America in 1776? Okay. Now, when we think of modern countries, okay, or when we think of the United States, well, one of the first things that we think about is the term is it a nation? Is it a nation? And certainly that's a model that you see across Europe, across much of the rest of the world. Right? The idea that a country should be a territory, a political entity that unites a nation of people. A good example here being Germany and the Germans. Germany is a nation state. It is a country, a place, a government, a set of borders. Why does it exist? What is its purpose? Okay. That is to unite the Germans. Okay. Well, who are the Germans? There are a bunch of people who speak German, okay, eat sausages, right, have other strange cultural customs and foodways that set them apart, say, from the French or the Poles, right, or other nations. Right? And this is the logic, then, behind the whole state, right, the reason for its existence. But, well, is the United States a nation state in the same sense? Right? Very tough to sell that idea, even today, when you might more talk about a shared common history of Americans or a shared national culture. Certainly back in 1776, right, that'd be an incredibly tough idea to put across, right? Especially because, well, the 13 colonies were an extremely diverse place, right? In large measure because of deliberate policy on the part of the British government. Right? The British had their own issues with national unity back home, and one of the ways that they dealt with a lot of their problems of diversity and internal conflict was to ship it across the water. Right? If you had religious dissenters, Puritans, Quakers, Catholics, anybody who didn't like the Church of England, what did you do? Sent them to America. If you had ethnic nationalist rebels like Jacobites in Scotland, right? Or various Irish rebel groups. Right? Mass executions just caused more resistance. An easier path was ship them off as indentured servants. Right? Criminals. What do you do with your criminals? Well, if you're British, you would send them to the penal colony in New South Wales in Australia, which they founded in 1788. The reason the British founded a penal colony on the other side of the planet in 1788 is because in 1783, the American Revolution had been concluded, America was independent, and the 13 colonies told the British government, stop sending us all your convicts, we don't want them anymore. Okay. Or you can even talk about slavery as well. Okay. British judges and officials and leaders were very opposed to the institution of slavery in Great Britain. Okay. As long as it was 3,000 miles across the ocean in the Americas, that was all fine and dandy. The profits were wonderful, and the problems that that institution created were a long, long way away. Okay. So, trying to create an American republic on the basis of a national identity in 1776 was a very dodgy project. And moreover, well, forming a separate American state on the basis of a political ideology, right, that was a dubious one as well. Because, again, American political ideology, or at least the political ideas of the men we usually refer to as the Founding Fathers, okay, were overwhelmingly English and very traditional. Okay? The way they presented themselves, well, it can be summed up in a pamphlet that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1774, the pamphlet that brought him to attention throughout the colonies and sent him on the path to Philadelphia and writing the Declaration of Independence. He titled it, A Summary View of the Rights of British America. And like so many other pre-revolutionary pamphlets and writings, what he did was appealed to English political tradition, colonial charters, okay, common law, ancient rights and customs dating back, right, to Magna Carta, right, and other documents. The argument that so many of these leaders made was not that they were forging some brave new world that was going to be decisively different from Britain, but rather, okay, that they were stopping innovations coming out of a corrupt government in London. They were preserving, okay, the old customs, the old traditions of English government and English law. So grounding that is, a basis for an entire separation from Britain was a questionable one. So my argument to you is a better way to think about America in 1776 was that it was an uncertain, mildly promising, but fraught with division and conflict alliance of very diverse communities and interests. Right? And the question of who would be in, who would be out, on what terms, how would this be negotiated, was very much up for grabs. Okay? And certainly you can see that in the case of the Quebecois. Right? The American Congress thought it was quite possible for French Canadians to be Americans. Some French Canadians themselves thought that this was possible. Others, on reflection, said, we don't think that we can fit into this, right? That our interests can be reconciled with the other groups of people who seem to be making up, right, this whole movement. Right? So this brings us to Tennessee. And one of the points I make immediately is that Tennessee in 1775, 1776 was a very small, obscure corner of British North America. Okay? Really, the only settlements were very much in this region of the upper Tennessee, the Holston, Nolichucky, and other rivers, only consisted of maybe 5,000 to 6,000 people. Right? They'd only been in this area for a few years. The first permanent settlement in what's now the state of Tennessee only took place in 1769. Right? So this was a very small group of people. Right? And so you turn around then and ask, okay, who were these people? And leaving aside any question of their Americanness or their political ideology, what were their interests? What were their goals, their ambitions? What were they trying to accomplish? Okay. Now, I'd say first that this was a migration that had not come necessarily straight west. Right? In fact, most of the colonists who settled in Upper East Tennessee had come down the Great Wagon Road and then down the Wilderness Road in the backcountry of Virginia, but ultimately from Philadelphia. Right? They were a diverse ethnic mix, certainly some English, okay, but also Scots-Irish, German, other British and European migrants, part in this as well. Okay. They were held together, right, such as they had a kind of a leadership structure and leadership cadre, by networks of prominent men coming out of Virginia. Okay. This settlement was still what was very clearly Virginia, and honestly, for the first several years that they were down in here, they didn't have good surveys of the line heading west across the mountains, and quite a lot of them thought for a number of years that they were settled in Virginia. Right? And so they looked for political authority to some very personal networks that ran back through Virginia. Okay? Leading settlers in this area, guys like John Sevier, Evan and Isaac Shelby, William Tatham, and so on. They were Virginians, were Eastern Virginians themselves, but they had moved into the area as store owners, station owners, particularly surveyors, and they were linked back up through political networks to men who were prominent in southwestern Virginia, like William Campbell and Joseph Martin. And men like Campbell and Martin particularly were connected through networks of personal contact and patronage to a really important guy in Virginia, Patrick Henry. Okay? And what did Patrick Henry say? Allegedly. Give me liberty or give me death, yes. Henry was the leading or the leader of kind of the patriot resistance movement against parliamentary legislation in Virginia. And when the last royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, abandoned the colony in 1775, Henry was elected the first governor of revolutionary Virginia. Right? And he was then the sort of patron of the other figures, right, like Richard Henry Lee, like Thomas Jefferson, like George Washington. Most all of them looked to Henry. Now, in addition to a political radical of that time, Henry was also one of the leading and most ambitious land speculators among upper-class Virginians. Okay. He had widespread interests and investments, right, in land claims in Ohio, Kentucky, southwestern Tennessee, right? And his activities and the networks of men who spread out from him down into the Upper East Tennessee settlements were tied together by that issue of land. Okay? These men, at the various levels that they operated, okay, very high level like Patrick Henry, down to local leaders like John Sevier and the Shelby brothers, okay, what they hoped to achieve was social mobility. Okay? These were ambitious men. They wanted to increase their wealth, their social standing, their political power. Okay? And particularly they wanted to do it through the acquisition and development of land in the West. Right? Much more than sort of traditional slave-owning tobacco planters. Right? These men chose a different route. Westward expansion, right? And as I said, upward social mobility and status was the thing that held them together. Okay. Now, the question then, if you understand and think about these interests, what did these men then think about the whole imperial crisis with Britain in the 1760s and 1770s? Now, not surprisingly, for men like John Sevier and Isaac Shelby, who were settled in Upper East Tennessee, they weren't too worried about things like the Quartering Act, okay, or the impressment of sailors into the Royal Navy, okay, or admiralty trials of convicted Atlantic smugglers without juries. Okay? Their grievances were things related to their own ambitions and interests. I'll point to three of them particularly. One, if you remember basic U.S. history, you probably recall the Proclamation Line of 1763. Okay? The British, at the close of the 7 Years' War, the authorities in London drew a line along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and prohibited American expansion west of that line. Now, a lot of your textbooks say that Americans pushed past that line, and it's true that they did, but it was a grievance because essentially what the British government had done is declared that, yes, you can go west of that line, but your settlement is illegal. Land isn't just dirt and trees. Right? Land also meant legal title, a document. Okay. And there was no court now that was going to enforce this. In fact, in East Tennessee, the settlers, when they found out that they were in fact over this line and over the Virginia line, seeing no legal authority that they could appeal to, well, what they did rather than leave is they appealed to the Cherokee, and they went straight to the Cherokee elders and they signed leases, right, for the land that they held, right, rather than going through the British government. Right? They'd also seen the British government, particularly Virginians, create a system of Indian agents. Okay? The Indian agent for the South was a man named John Stewart. He was stationed down in Pensacola, Florida, and he claimed all power then to negotiate with the southern tribes, effectively stripping that power from the colony of Virginia and the other southern colonies. The government had also set up a colonial office to centralize and rationalize colonial administration off in London, further stripping the possibility of westward expansion, control of Indian land treaties and Indian trade negotiations away from the colonists themselves. Right? They saw their ability, their rights, their power, right, being taken away by the British government. Right? And this was then the initial thing that tied these men to the American Revolution. Right? I'll refer to it in the way, in fact, a lot of people at the time referred to what became Tennessee the over mountain country. Right? That's all it was referred to as. Their willingness to side with the idea of first armed resistance and then an independent republic, an independent American republic, was cemented first by the Cherokee War of 1776. Encouraged by British military commanders, the Cherokee broke the leases that they had with the Watauga and launched a series of deadly attacks on the settlements in Upper East Tennessee. The idea that the British had was that, well, these attacks would prove to frontier colonists that they couldn't trust, right, Eastern leaders, patriots like Patrick Henry. Right? And this would then drive Westerners back into the arms of the only force allegedly that could protect them, the British. Now, Patrick Henry, for his part, read this strategy and committed Virginia wholeheartedly to supporting Western settlements. Right? He raised in late 76 or into 77 multiple regiments of Virginia militia, marched them deep into the Tennessee country, sacked the Cherokee homeland, burning towns and crops, and forcing the tribe into a peace that kept them out of the American Revolution for the rest of the conflict. Right? And that campaign then cemented, really, at least for a time, Western loyalty to the cause of the American Republic, which, again, understand really for them was what was being sold to them by Patrick Henry, largely. Right? And particularly it freed up the Tennesseans, or the over mountain men as they were sometimes called, for their major military participation in the Revolution, which was when Sevier, Campbell, and Shelby led over mountain militias back across the mountains in 1779, 1780, and they took part in the Battle of Kings Mountain, which was a major defeat for Loyalist and British troops that contributed to the failure of the British Southern campaign and eventual retreat of the Southern British commander, Lord Cornwallis, to Yorktown, where he was surrounded and forced to surrender in the next year. But you note immediately, one of the things about the Kings Mountain campaign is that it meant that, large chunk of the men of this frontier settlement had to leave their wives and children on the frontier for weeks while they headed back east over the mountains. They were only willing to do that on the back of the peace that had been forced on the Cherokee by the War of 1777 and backed up by Joseph Martin, Patrick Henry's man on the southwestern frontier, who went, rather than to Kings Mountain, went down to the Cherokee towns, bullied, threatened, cajoled, pleaded, and kept the main body of the Cherokee from seeing the British invasion of the South as an opportunity to go back to war. Right? Secure enough in their local interests, they were willing to turn, right, and recommit themselves to the broader American military cause. But their loyalty to the American Republic remained very conditional on their regional and local interests. Okay? And with the end of the Revolution on through the 1780s, settlers in what became Tennessee were frequently disappointed, okay, by this new American Republic. Right? When they attempted to separate from North Carolina and formed the brief, short-lived state of Franklin in the 1780s, they applied, or they petitioned Congress for admission as a state. Congress refused that petition, sided with the North Carolina government. Right? And interestingly, while they were doing that, okay, Congress also did the first sort of central U.S. negotiations with the Cherokee. In 1785, went down and negotiated a treaty, the Council Ground in Hopewell, South Carolina, which in fact gave back to the Cherokee, attempting to buy peace with the tribe, gave back to them a lot of the land that had been seized as a result of the Virginia campaign in 1776, 1777. So faced with that, while they were negotiating, Western leaders also dabbled with what came to be called the Spanish conspiracy. Right? They were concerned about possible attacks from the southwestern tribes, particularly if those attacks would be funded by and supported by the Spanish authorities in Florida and Louisiana. And they also were very concerned about that largely they had crossed the mountains in hopes of getting land. If they were going to profit from that land, they needed to be able to ship crops and other goods down the Tennessee, down the Cumberland, and then down the Mississippi through New Orleans. And the Spanish, in return, demanded, well, if we're going to let you trade, right, through New Orleans, if we're going to refuse to prop up or push war, right, and supply weapons to the southwestern tribes, you people need to swear loyalty to the King of Spain. Okay? Now, there had been rumors that certain Tennessee leaders like James Robertson and Andrew Jackson had done this, which, good, honest Tennessee historians and patriots had long refused to countenance because they would, Andrew Jackson would never do something like this. He was a good, honest American. Until some of those revisionist historians went into the actual Spanish archives that survive in Havana, and yeah, they found Jackson's signature on an oath of loyalty to the King of Spain, along with James Robertson and many of the others. But I say to them, don't worry, okay? They were lying to the King of Spain. Right? They were never particularly loyal to him or the Spanish state either. Right? During the 1790s, when the region was incorporated into the United States as the Southwest Territory, Tennesseans still were disappointed because the Federalist Washington administration insisted on centering their efforts at Western expansion in Ohio and Indiana. And they told authorities in the Southwest to keep the peace, which Southwesterners didn't want to do. And so they went ahead and went to war anyway. Right? Particularly notorious was the Nickajack campaign, where James Robertson organized the militias of Middle Tennessee, marched south to attack the Chickamauga Cherokee in their settlements in northern Alabama, despite orders. Okay? Fascinating. There's couple letters survive from the territorial governor, William Blount, who was also a prominent Western land speculator. Blount basically sent Robertson this series of letters that said, all right, do not attack the Chickamauga towns. Do not take these two roads. And do not cross the Tennessee River at this ford, and do not use these regiments, and do not contact Colonel so-and-so in this other military district and get his help on this. Don't do it. And oddly enough, Robertson just went off and did exactly what Blount told him not to do. And when he came back, Blount said, I'm very disappointed in you. I'm very disappointed in you. Now let's get back to talking about our land speculation investments that we're in together. Okay. I'll say this, Robertson was smart enough, probably, not to get involved in William Blount's grandest scheme, and that was 1796, when he was caught, in fact, while he was one of the first U.S. senators from Tennessee after Tennessee statehood, he was caught in a conspiracy with leading Westerners to ally themselves with the British to do a joint invasion of Spanish Florida and Spanish Louisiana, to then turn those territories over to the British Empire in exchange for major land speculation concessions that Blount and other Tennesseans were going to get. When this was revealed, there was shock, horror in Congress. Blount became the first man to be impeached under the U.S. Constitution. He fled back to Tennessee, where Tennesseans, appalled by his betrayal, promptly elected him to the state legislature and made him Speaker of the State House. Their loyalty, as I said, and their vision of America remained very tightly tied to their own regional interests, right? And that was something that, in fact, continued, okay, across much of the antebellum era, okay? The Tennesseans did, in a sense, win, okay, at a national level, get the American government as a whole, beginning with Thomas Jefferson and then through the War of 1812, to commit itself to their big project, which was the conquest of the greater Mississippi Valley, okay, which was the great success, okay, of the War of 1812 for the United States. Right? From the point of view of Tennesseans, yes, the British Army burned Washington, so what? But we did chase them out of New Orleans, right? Which was a much more valuable victory from the point of view of Westerners. And that then cleared the way, okay, for westward expansion and culminating in Jackson's presidency and Indian removal. But even then, okay, understand the extent to which that project of upward social mobility through acquisition of land and westward expansion remains central to a lot of Tennesseans' sense of national identity, right? And sense of their interests. Leave that then with Sam Houston, right? Native Tennessean, like many other Tennesseans, Davy Crockett among others, who in fact, in search of that upward mobility, left the United States in the 1820s and 1830s and went and settled in Mexican Texas, okay, and then led a revolution against Mexico and established an independent Republic of Texas. Okay. And Sam Houston himself, he did back American annexation of Texas, but mainly because he thought that it would secure the financial and legal legitimacy of the state's land claims and protect it from a possible re-invasion by the Mexicans. Right? Indeed, many of the descendants of Tennessee settlers in Texas joined in the movement to take Texas out of the United States in 1860, 1861. Right? Sam Houston himself, though, he refused to support this, and he remained an ardent Unionist. Right? Not because he had any particular opposition to slavery. He was a slave owner throughout his life and throughout his career, but rather because he believed that, well, the Confederacy was a dodgy enterprise, and particularly if the state of Texas committed itself militarily to the Southern War of Independence, it would involve pulling a whole bunch of Texans out of the state, sending them off to fight in odd places like, well, Tennessee and Virginia as well, and leaving Texas, especially the Texas frontier, exposed to raids by the Comanche. Right? In fact, on that point, he was proven right. During the Civil War, the Comanche launched devastating attacks, drove Texas settlement back, right, hundreds of miles, right, into the eastern part of the state. Right? But again, Houston's loyalty to the United States remained couched in his very local identity and his personal interests. Right? So, my conclusion here, right, is that American nationalism, such as it is, right, is a very uncertain, right, and conditional thing. Right? It has been going all the way back to the Revolution. Right? Instead, the country's identity is one of a kind of overlapping, or at least non-conflicting, community of diverse interests. And if there is a singular genius to our political institutions, it's their ability through individual rights, through states' rights as well, right? Through multi-level democratic elections, right, to incorporate that diversity, right, and maintain a degree of peace within all of those different interests, right, as difficult as those compromises may at times be. And that's it. Before your 5 minutes. I think actually he had one.
Yeah, I was just curious about if the Quebecois were kind of under the same pressures as American colonists, which I would assume they would have been, like lack of representation in Parliament, impressment of sailors and whatnot.
To a degree, although I'd say their issues, as they particularly understood them, were different. And in fact, lack of representation, they weren't enthusiastic about the idea of self-government at all. They didn't want an elected assembly because of their worry that all these New Englanders would flood in and outvote them.
But I was also curious that in the sake of the British, did the Quebecois have any representation in Parliament as well? And like that's kind of like what I was...
Yeah, no.
Why would they have seen so much of a difference in the fact they already weren't represented at all?
Well, again, their main... Now we're getting into some of the details. The British Parliament in 1774 passed a piece of legislation for organizing a government for the province. It was called the Quebec Act. Okay. The Quebec Act incorporated a number of concessions to the native population. They maintained French law rather than replacing French law with English common law. They kept the Roman Catholic Church as the established church. right? State-supported and official. And also did not do, as I said, what they had done in a bunch of other colonies, which is put in a representative assembly to handle local government. Instead, they just give one single military governor. And again, from the perspective of a lot of the Québécois then, the question here is not that they were particularly happy under British rule, but the option of being part of this American republic seemed a lot more risky. Could you trust a bunch of people, well, who were the worst sort of Protestant heretics, the worst sort of, well, English political traditionalists yelling about the common law, committed to landed expansion and so on? They said, well, we'd rather try our luck with, or we'll stick for the moment with the British Empire. But if you know anything about Canadian politics, it's not because they like the British Empire. Okay?
We have time for one more question?
You have a follow-up?
I was just kind of curious about, like, would there have ever been any, like aristocratic people from, like, Rhode Island, like the only, like, primarily Catholic colony in the Americas? Were there ever any?
Maryland. Maryland would have been the Catholic colony. In fact, the legacy there was that the Catholic leadership of Maryland had been sort of overthrown all the way back during the Glorious Revolution in the 1680s by Protestant colonists, and they had been excluded from public life. Okay.
All righty, let's give Dr. Nelson one more round of applause.
Thank you.